Donald Trump calls on Republicans to nationalize voting, drawing pushback from GOP senators, including Majority Leader John Thune, as Congress takes up debate on the Save America Act to require citizenship checks for voter registration. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the opinion pages, columnists Kim Strassel and Barton Swaim. For 4 years, Republicans resisted Democratic efforts under Joe Biden to nationalize federal elections, back when Nancy Pelosi wanted to pass H.R. 1, a bill to enshrine pandemic mail voting as a permanent feature of American elections. Yet now it's President Trump who's calling on Republicans to take over vote counting in at least some states. Here he is earlier this week on a podcast with Dan Bongino, the former deputy FBI director.
These people were brought to our country to vote, and they vote illegally. And amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
Republicans responded to that initial comment by suggesting that President Trump was referring there to the SAVE Act. But the president then seemed to double down later this week with reporters in the Oval Office. He called the states agents of the federal government to count the votes and said if they can't count the votes legally and honestly, then somebody else should take over, unquote. Kim, I have a hard time understanding what that would even look like, given that we have a constitution that says federal elections are generally run by the states, though Congress can set some rules and regulations. And all the local administration is at Secretary of State's offices, local county offices. I'm having trouble envisioning what Trump has in mind there.
I think people are still confused about what Donald Trump actually wants to do. I mean, when I hear the word nationalize elections, I think of what Democrats have been trying to do for the past 5 years with this bill they introduced called the For the People Act, which was a silly name. But it would have basically set a uniform set of very lax voting rules that would be imposed from above, from the federal level, on all the 50 states, and would essentially make every state look like California's voting rules. We can go through what was so terrible about that. And it was a terrible, terrible idea. The other way, and I don't think that Donald Trump is actually proposing that, anything sweeping like that. Instead, he seems to be interested, as that comment just said, in having the feds go in and take over in election periods the administration and running of certain big blue areas, like think Fulton County, Georgia, all of these areas where Republican voters in particular became very worried that there was, shenanigans going on in the dark room that nobody could see, and the votes weren't being counted properly. And so he seems to be suggesting that the feds roll in and take over that process. I mean, quite aside from the logistical nightmare that you mentioned this, because actually one of the great things about our voting system in this country is it is hugely decentralized, and every state and every locality kind of has their own way of doing this. And it's very, very local, down to the precinct level, and local, observers and volunteers who engage in this. So how you would, that would even work in terms of practice or coordination. And you could end up with a lot more confusion and a lot less certainty about what really happened in the counting of the votes, because the people that were coming in to take over systems that they were not familiar with and did not know how anything actually operated. But that's before you get to the enormous intrusion on states' rights, which is, of course, the reason Republicans outright rejected the Democratic moves to nationalize elections. And, there is now some talk about some kind of minimum requirements that Republicans are floating around with this SAVE Act, which we'll get into, not anywhere near as sweeping as the Democrats. But even that, I think, is giving some GOP members concerns just in terms of federalism and states' rights.
To give a sense of the flavor of that pushback, so here is Majority Leader John Thune. He said, I'm a big believer in decentralized, distributed power. I think it's harder to hack 50 election systems than it is to hack one. Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, asked about nationalizing elections, said, that's not what the Constitution says. Ron Johnson of Wisconsin also against this idea. What seems to be motivating Trump, based on his comments on that podcast and in other places, is the idea that there are many non-citizens that are voting in these elections, illegal aliens who've just come in, who are swaying the outcomes. President Trump again told Dan Bongino that he won 2020. He claimed, Barton, that he won Minnesota 3 times in 2016, 2020, and 2024, which to me stretches credulity. Minnesota is a pretty solidly blue state. Didn't even go for Republicans in 1984 in Reagan's landslide that year. And we can also look at some audits over the years that have suggested this non-citizen voting problem happens, but not anywhere near the kind of frequency that President Trump is talking about. So to pick a couple of swing states, in Georgia, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger did an audit in 2024 of the 8.2 million registered voters on the rolls at that time. It found 20 non-citizens on the rolls. 11 of them had never voted. And then there were about 150 other people whose immigration status was not clear. They were referred for further investigation. Last year, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson said that her office had done a cross-check of the voter rolls against the driver's license records and found 15 people who appear to be non-U.S. citizens who cast ballot in the 2024 election. Those people were referred for prosecution, which I think is appropriate. It is also important for deterrence, always important to be vigilant about these things. But Barton, it suggests that the president is still looking for and pushing these theories of mass fraud and trying to respond to them on the ground with policies that he thinks can fight it. But where is the mass fraud? I'm still looking for the real solid evidence of it.
Well, let me back up and just point out, Kyle, that Walter Mondale was from Minnesota, so Reagan would have won Minnesota in 1984. I read Trump's initial comments, just to focus on that for a second, as a little like, his comments like, I'm going to be a dictator for a day and things like that, almost a deliberate attempt to troll the other side. The word nationalize doesn't even make sense when you're talking about, what did he say, 15 states? Well, it's not nationalizing if it's only 15 states, is it? So it's almost like one of those off the top of his head things, like the wall, the original wall that Mexico was going to pay for was sort of a thing that he made up on the spot. I'm inclined not to take it too terribly seriously. Unfortunately, many other of his most fervent supporters do. On the point about fraud, you're absolutely right. The evidence is sparse to non-existent. And it's a little like the claim that I think too many Republicans were making some months ago about illegal aliens on Medicaid. It's not actually a serious problem. I'm not saying it's non-existent, but it's not the real reason that you should reform Medicaid because illegal immigrants are using it. I think John Thune makes the best point out of any of this, is that we have a system in which our elections are run by a highly decentralized system. And as I think our editorial pointed out, it's very hard to hack into one. You need to know how to hack into them all. And if it's one big nationalized system, that's a lot easier for a sophisticated fraudster. And I would also point out that not only do you have to know how to hack into many different systems in a decentralized one like ours, you have to know which ones are the ones in which the vote is going to be close. And that's really important. I mean, I know we're talking about midterm elections, but if you think about just the principle of the Electoral College, if you wanted to cheat in the right state, you'd have to know which one it's going to be really close in. And we never seem to know. We all thought it was going to be Florida at one point. Then we thought it was going to be Ohio when it had been Ohio in 2004. And then who knew in 2016 that it would be these Midwestern, the blue wall states. So I think the same principle holds at a more local and state level, that it's sort of a brilliant system that doesn't, to my mind, need to be tampered with just because it resists attempts to commit fraud so effectively.
Another of the challenges to this idea that Trump puts forth of mass non-citizen voting is simply the incentives. There are a lot of people who came into the country illegally under President Biden, or they were let in on some kind of asylum claim or whatnot. But many of them are trying very hard, it seems to me, to not be noticed, to not commit crimes, to not come on ICE's radar. So they want to stay because they see economic opportunity here that doesn't exist in their home countries. And voting illegally, it seems to me, the payoff given one vote is pretty small for the risk that illegal alien would be taking in terms of getting caught, getting put in prison maybe, and then getting deported. Which is not to say, Kim, that voter ID laws or identity checks are a bad idea, because, again, you always have to be on guard against this sort of stuff. And shenanigans really do happen, particularly at the local level, examples in like city council races and so forth, of elections that are decided by small numbers of ballots, where there are real systematic attempts by candidates to steal elections. And so there's always a need to stay on guard. Kim, to that point, the Republicans are not talking about taking up the Save America Act, a version of this passed the House last year called the SAVE Act. Give listeners a sense of the provisions of this bill and how the debate is playing out in Congress.
Yeah, and just to your prior point, I would point out here that notable, we already have federal law already bars non-citizens from voting in federal elections. Some states have additionally passed their own laws, making clear the practice is outlawed and imposing penalties for those who attempt to or engage in the practice. And one of the problems here, it just needs to be noted, is that if all states were diligent about doing the kind of audits that you just mentioned, in Georgia, for instance, or in Michigan, there was also an audit in Texas that showed about 2,700 non-citizens who were registered to vote. But that's out of a population of 18.6 million registered voters. But if more states were doing this, then there probably would not be this push to now enact additional federal legislation on this. And so some of the blame here goes to these blue states and blue jurisdictions that just resolutely refuse to look into their voter rolls and to engage in some sort of, minimum hygiene to make sure their voter rolls are accurate. And that really fuels distrust out there. So in terms of the SAVE Act, what it does is there's two main provisions. The first provision essentially says that if you go to register to vote, from now on, if this law were in practice, you would need to provide proof of citizenship upon doing that. And there's a lot of different complicated alternate procedures you can go through. For instance, if you don't have a birth certificate, you don't have a passport, something that proves your United States citizenship. There's a second provision, which is also now getting some real attention, that says that when you go to actually vote, you're going to need to show a photo ID. And, this is really interesting to me, Kyle, because voter ID is extremely popular. It's one of those 80-20 issues out there. There was an August 2025 Pew poll that showed that 95% of Republicans and 71% of Democrats favor voter ID. 2024 Gallup poll found that 84% of Americans support voter ID. And by the way, 83% support proof of citizenship to register to vote. So in theory, this bill could be, it's going along something that has a lot of popular support. The problem is that it's also looks like it's very complicated. The question of the registration piece, I can see that. But the photo ID aspect of it, the way that in order to vote, the way that the language is presented in the bill is it says that the photo ID you present also has to provide an indication on the front of it of your citizenship. Now, some real IDs do that. Apparently in some states, because states issue real IDs, some of them do not. And so there's a lot of confusion about what would therefore count as a valid photo ID when you go. These are the sort of things that end up becoming very complicated. And then as a result, people, once they hear the details, then they sort of sour on their broad popularity or, their broad support of an issue. So, this might end up being this interesting scenario where Republicans are taking what should be just like a home run issue for them, and kind of messing with it because they've got so far on the bandwagon of Donald Trump's language about citizenship. And again, given the numbers we pointed out, it is a problem, but it's not an enormous one. And do you want to kind of throw that winner of a political issue down the toilet because you're going to kind of stick on this talking point that has become that so animates the president of the United States?
I agree with Kim here. I think the devil is in the details on these kinds of proposals. Voter ID, I think, has very high approval in the abstract because it strikes people as reasonable. You get on a plane, you show an ID, you go to the store and buy some beer, you show a driver's license. But for the provision in the Save America Act on voter registration, again, it says that to register to vote, you have to show proof of citizenship. One proof of citizenship would be a Real ID Act of 2005 that indicates the applicant is a citizen of the United States. So there are many people who have driver's licenses in their pockets that they use to buy beer and so forth that would not be qualifying as a proof of identity, proof of citizenship for the purposes of registering to vote. I know it's been a long time since the Real ID Act passed, but I, for one, again, do not have a Real ID in my pocket. And as it turns out, the state of New Jersey is not a well-oiled machine. I saw a figure last year that New Jersey had the lowest Real ID compliance percentage, only about 20% of state residents. In my case, I keep on checking the website for the Motor Vehicle Commission, looking for appointments. At one point, the Real ID upgrade appointments were totally booked statewide. I looked again this morning, and in some locations, Motor Vehicle Commission locations, the earliest available appointment to get a Real ID is in May. And again, the Save America Act says that its provisions are effective immediately on passage for all voter registrations and elections after that point. And so, Barton, to the point Kim is making here, I agree that voter ID is very popular if it is framed effectively. If it is drawn up in a way that is administrable and it makes sense to people, and it is not going to cause people headaches. When they go to register to vote for the next election, when they show up at the polls and they find out, hang on, this driver's license that I've had ever since I moved to the state of New Jersey is no longer accepted for this purpose. That I think explains some of the hesitation and why this is still, despite the polling for voter ID in general, why this is still up for debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to me about maybe a decade ago or more, when Republicans were really pushing for voter ID, just a basic photo ID at a voting booth, at a precinct, there was tremendous resistance to this in red and blue states by Democrats on the grounds that Republicans were trying to, intimidate people of lower income who maybe don't have a driver's license and so on into not voting. That always seemed very much a stretch to me. And I was, and still am, in favor of the idea that if you're going to vote in an American election, it should be slightly inconvenient to do that, okay? So I don't like mail-in ballot voting, super convenient, all the rest of it. I think it is a kind of national right we go through, and as such, we should have to do a little work in order to participate. We've gone well past that now. I think Republicans have pretty much won that debate, at least in the public opinion. But now they want to squander it with stupid stuff like this, in which they're going to create tremendous national upheaval if they pass a bill or threaten to that would penalize people who've been voting for years legally and now who can't for some reason. It's a typical instance of Republicans snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
Kim, one final point when we're talking about the decentralized nature of American elections under the Constitution, under the federalist system we have. After Democrats spent 4 years trying to nationalize these rules, you know who should be thanking the stars that we have decentralized elections run by states and counties in the United States is the Democratic Party. Because a lot of the rhetoric you hear these days is about how President Trump is a budding authoritarian. And yet, look at the polling. Democrats, I think, are well favored in the midterm elections in 2026. And so it's kind of convenient for them that, you know, who doesn't have any control over those elections is the president of the United States. There is some loose talk on the right about how President Trump might, you know, send ICE agents to polling sites and so forth. Let's listen to Steve Bannon floating that idea on his podcast this week.
And you're damn right. We're going to have ICE surround the polls come November. We're not going to sit here and allow you to steal the country again. And you can whine and cry and throw your toys out of the pram all you want, but we will never again allow an election to be stolen.
Kim, what strikes me about that idea is, remember that the largest share of voters in the United States are political independents, 45% according to Gallup. And do you know what would make independents turn against Republicans faster than anything? It is to take what is happening in Minnesota and the political debacle that the Trump administration has created and do the same thing at every polling site around the country. I have a hard time thinking of an idea that would lead more to a Republican wipeout in the midterms than that.
You know, I do actually wonder, though, just on your point on Democrats, I sometimes wonder if Donald Trump doesn't sit around in the Oval Office and think of things to say just to trigger the Democratic Party into doing a 180 on all of their policy positions. I mean, you know, this is a Democratic Party that over the past 4 or 5 years, ever since they introduced that legislation I told you about to turn all of America into California's voting system, you know, they've been going on and on whining about states' rights and the states are terrible and the states should, you know, have looser voting procedures. And the only way to do that is to nationalize elections. And now the howling out there, you know, the idea that the federal government might be involved in any way, shape, or form with a local election, which, by the way, I agree with. But to hear it coming out of the mouths of Democrats is just absolutely hilarious to me. And I could not agree more with Barton and you on this point. Look, this is an issue. Just strip away all the noise and the nonsense. Voter ID, longtime Republican ambition, lots of support for it out there in the country. Pass it through the House, send it to the Senate, and force the Democrats on a very straightforward bill requiring some minimum level of voter ID, maybe giving the states some say in how those voter IDs, what types can be used, just to sort of give, so like a minimum standard. Keep it clean, keep it simple, and put it in the Senate and force the Democrats to have to vote against that. That's a winner. But all of this is getting clouded. And yes, the notion of like sending in the airborne divisions of the military to go surround polling places and think that the visuals of that will somehow help the Republican Party. No, what most Americans want. And look, this is a legitimate discussion to be having. There was a bunch of nonsense that went around prior to the 2020 election, mostly Democrats who were using lockdowns and COVID as an excuse to change voting rules midstream. Okay. And that really sowed distrust in the system overall. It came on the back of, more than a decade of a lot of states doing a bunch of loopy stuff with their voting systems as well. We now have states with all mail-in ballot voting, which I just think is totally nuts. Long early voting periods where people are beginning to vote in the summer for, November elections. We have election months, not election day. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. And I think the way this has been put most succinctly by people I trust that are real kind of election integrity experts is, having voting on the day in the room with election officials is the best way to make sure that everything is done by the book. The farther away that whole process moves from people who actually have eyes on what is happening, the more problems there are. And all of this is combined to leave people extremely uneasy. And Republicans should be using that to push ahead on some of these basic ideas, which they have promoted for a long time and are winning on. And instead, all of this is getting confused with the president's focus on illegal immigrants and questions about what happened in Fulton County, and it's muddying what ought to be a winner.
Thank you, Kim and Barton. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.